Welcome to my beginning watercolor tip 19, moisture content part 2, working with saturated paper. In this video, I'll do an exercise that focuses on working on saturated paper. There's two components to this exercise. The first one is demonstrating the brush strokes working with a saturated brush, a damp brush, and a low moisture brush on saturated paper. The second component is a small composition. To begin this exercise, I'm going to take a 1-inch wash brush and apply clear water to this left area of my little exercise paper. And I'm going to be very liberal with the water, making sure that I've got this area of the paper nice and wet. You notice me taking my brush along the side here. If you take a damp brush, it'll soak up any unwanted water, so that's what I'm doing on the side there. But I'm going over it a number of times just to make sure that I've got a good saturation of water. Now that I know my paper is saturated, I'm going to take a loaded brush with pigment in it, and it's a saturated brush. It's got a lot of water in the paint mixture, and it's fully loaded my brush. And you can see when I touch it to the paper and make a brush stroke, it starts to diffuse quickly, and actually gravity, because I'm on an incline here, starts to take that pigment and it starts to go towards the bottom because of the angle that I'm working at. Next, I'm going to take a damp brush loaded with pigment and make a brush mark. So you can see that it doesn't have near the movement with the pigment. It still has very diffused edges. And what's the difference between damp and saturated? The saturated is really loaded with water. In the damp brush, I've dipped it in the pigment, but I've taken away some of the moisture by touching it to a cloth. Now the low moisture brush, which I'm putting in now, you can see the edge is soft, but it's not diffused quite as much as the other two. But it's still a softer edge. And in this brush, I say it's low moisture. I actually had a little bit too much water probably still, and I put a little more pigment. So it's a little bit beyond damp. It's brushed off on the towel, taking away most of the water, and loaded with a thicker pigment. So you can see the different results that you get with those brush strokes. Next, I'm going to start working on this small composition. So I'm putting water on the right half of my exercise sheet. However, unlike the left side where I just put it over the whole area, I'm putting it where I want the moisture to be. So I'm in control. Even though this is going to be a very loose wash, I have control of where it's going to go because I'm deciding where the moisture is going to be on my paper, on my work surface. If I just cover the whole page, it would be a very loose wash that I would have little control over. So because I'm deciding where the paper is going to be wet, that wash is going to flow down, and it's just going to go around this building structure and stop on that horizon line, because that's where I've decided to put an end to where the moisture is going to be in the paper. The same when you're working on a painting. If you want to do some wet on wet, you don't have to wet an entire area, and oftentimes you may not want to because you want to control a loose wash. So now I'm taking my color, and I've got this same 1/2-inch brush, and it's a loaded brush. So right now I have a saturated brush, just as I did on the top left, and I'm putting it on this saturated paper, and you can see that it achieves very soft edges, and it's coming down because I'm working on an incline. I have control of which way the paint's going to flow, and it's coming down around the building structure and stopping on the horizon line because that's where I've put the moisture in my paper. I'm still in control of this very loose wash. And you can do this in much smaller shapes, in smaller areas. You can have this nice loose watercolor feeling, but it can still be in small shapes. And now I've dried it, I'm going to come in, and now I'm going to start to work with a damp brush on saturated paper. I want this to flow away from this horizon line, so I've turned my work surface upside down, And here again, I'm putting clear water on my paper, and I'm doing it around this building structure again. So the first application of paint was a saturated brush on saturated paper, and now I'm going to be working with a damp brush on saturated paper. So again, the difference between saturated brush and a damp brush, my saturated brush is dripping with paint mixture and water. My damp brush, I've taken off that excess, and I still have the paint mixture in there, but there's much less water content in it. So here's where I'm going to get a larger brush here and re-wet this because it started to dry out a little bit. Now I'm going to take my 1/2 inch brush with pigment, and I'm going to come in here and touch it to this horizon line and let it come down. So this is again, it's a damp brush. It's not dripping wet, but it still has quite a bit of moisture in it, and it's a little richer with pigment than the first mixture that I had, which was really loaded up with water. So in this little composition I have, this is given the suggestion of kind of tree shapes, distant tree shapes. So it has more of a shape to it than the saturated on saturated paper, but it's still very soft edged, diffused color. At this point, I've turned my work surface back around, and I'm applying water right on the corners of this structure. So again, I'm not putting water all over the paper. I'm just putting it in the area that I want to paint right now. And now I'm going to use a low moisture brush. And I say low moisture, a lot of times people would refer to this as a dry brush, but it's not really dry. It still has paint in it. So I'm saying low moisture. It's got most of the water taken out and a thicker mixture of paint. So now that I've saturated that area, I'm going to come in with this low moisture brush, which has a thicker pigment, and you can see how it's going to hold its shape a bit more, and it's still though going to diffuse along the edge and give me a soft edge, except right against the building structure, because that's where my wash stopped, and it's going to go right up to that, and it's just going to create a hard edge. But as I go away from the building where the water is, I'm not going completely out to the area that's wet, so it starts to diffuse out. So on the building side of these shapes that I'm painting, it's a hard edge because it's going right up against the dry paper. And on the going away side from the building, it's a softer diffused edge, but still not near as soft of an edge as I have with the damp or the saturated brush. So now just to do a quick review, on the left, the exercise with the brush marks started with a saturated brush, then went to a damp brush, and then a low moisture brush, all on saturated paper. And on the right side, where the small composition exercise was at, I used the same variations of brushes: a saturated brush, the damp brush, and the low moisture brush. So I use those three different variations of loading the brush and moisture content in my brush, all on saturated paper, to paint this little composition. Now, the thing to remember, even though this was on saturated paper and very loose wash, I still remained in control of what was going on because I controlled where the moisture was on my paper. I didn't just saturate the whole paper and start painting this. I did it strategically, and this is how I was able to preserve the whites where I wanted them. And that completes this exercise working on saturated paper with a saturated brush, a damp brush, and a low moisture brush. And what I want to point out is the importance understanding the moisture content played in this little exercise. You can see by looking at the brush marks how diffused and very soft edge the brush stroke was using a saturated brush on saturated paper. And the damp brush wasn't as free flowing, but it's still a very soft edged shape. And the low moisture, if you look more towards the right of that brush stroke where I came back in with a little thicker pigment, you can see that holds its form a little bit better, and it's still, though, a soft edge. On the left, you can see how you're not going to get hard edges working wet on wet paper. So when you're applying any of those three brush configurations on saturated paper, it's going to result in a soft edge. However, to the right, you can see where even though you're still working wet into wet, you can end up with hard edges because of the ability to control where the moisture is in the paper. So while you're working wet and wet, you can make some very sharp edges by not saturating the whole area of the paper and have breaks in it. That can come into play, especially when you're working with like reflections in water. You'll have breaks in the reflection in the water where the light's reflecting off of it, and by limiting where the areas of moisture are and applying the wash within those areas, you'll get this broken hard-edged effect, even though what's going on in the actual wet area is going to be diffused soft color. And that concludes this video, Beginning Watercolor Tip 19, Moisture Content Part 2, working on saturated paper. Be sure to look out for Beginning Watercolor Tip 20, Moisture Content Part 3, working on damp paper, which will follow this video in this series. Check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor, friends and subscribers on Facebook. And if you have questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page on my website, rsurowitzart.com. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.